Call to order of a work session of Goodyear City Council, Tuesday, October 9, 2007. We have one item on our agenda. It's a staff and consultant input on various issues and questions concerning the City Center Northwest Master Plan. And ready to go? Brett.
Mayor Kavanaugh, members of the council, good evening. We're excited to be here to report on the efforts that have gone forward subsequent to our work session on July 2nd. We have a presentation. Mr. Joe Spada and Mr. Doug Campbell will walk us through about a 20-minute presentation. There are several slides. Essentially, the consultant team is going to tell the story where we have been, since the July 2nd meeting. A conceptual plan will also be shown and described, and certain issues associated with that plan will be identified, and discussion topics will continue through this presentation. And although no formal action is required in this meeting, we do need to make sure that the council is we need to make sure that there are no negative reactions or no negative components of the plan. If there are issues associated with the plan, we need to make sure that we identify those, we talk about those, and resolve those issues before we move forward, or at least identify items that do need continued resolution. So with that, we'll ask Eddie to load the presentation. As I mentioned, there's about 20 minutes for the presentation. A lot of these slides were designed to answer a lot of the questions that we've been hearing. So hopefully a lot of the questions will be answered, but there will be ample time for questions and answers from the consultant team and from staff. So with that, I'll turn it over to Joe Spada.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor and the council, for having us back. We'll go through a couple of things. The first will be to just let you know what we've been doing since we last saw you on the 2nd of July. We've gone out and we've had numerous meetings, both internally with staff as well as with numerous external stakeholders who are going to help make the city center what we all hope it can be. This includes several of the universities who are both in negotiation and in agreement with the city, the library district, the folks at Sun MP, the high school, and various developers as part of the RFQ process. We've also made good progress on the city administration building programming task. Some of you may be aware of various questionnaires and interviews and data collection exercises that have been taking place over the past few months. We're almost at the point of a preliminary space program, which will ultimately be fed into the RFP for the administration building. There was also a branding task held last month that some of you participated in, I believe, to think about more larger themes and identity issues for the city center. As far as the P3 developer procurement side of this, both RFQs for the Performing Arts Center and for the remainder of the 40 acres have been put out on the street, and there was a pre-con meeting held on the 27th that was very well attended, and many questions were raised, and we see that moving along fairly smoothly. We're expecting responses sometime early in next month, I believe, and the RFP will be going out shortly thereafter. What we're here to talk about tonight primarily is the master plan concept development. We've been through a number of steps in this, including a further detailed review of the specific area plan, the identification of program elements, getting to the criteria that will go into the RFP for those elements, one of which is the specific program for the City Hall as well as other things. We've gone through what we call the bubble diagram step, which was to really go through a whole range of potential scenarios, and we've talked to staff at multiple levels on that. Just want to reiterate as we move into the plan itself that the specific area plan that you all worked so hard on over the past few years remains the basis for everything that we're doing. There are a lot of new factors out there that we have to consider, but as we move forward, that is always in our minds and on paper and in the legislative content. Some of these new factors that have made us relook at certain things within the area plan include the decision and agreements to go ahead with the stadium project to the south, the inclusion of the universities in the 100-acre tract to the north, the fact that Sun Chase MP is now actively underway in developing their own site plans for the other 3 quadrants, and peripheral factors such as the West Core project up on I-10. We've also been able to identify the key elements, or think we've identified the key elements based upon your input in other meetings, those being the Performing Arts Center, the library, the Multi-Gen Center, and fundamentally to have a city hall and council chambers available in the fall of 2009. Key design issues as we move forward into the plan include taking those themes and ideas of the specific area plan, which was focused in the northwest quadrant, but to now extend those and bring those themes through into the 100-acre tract and think of this as a unified design concept, and to address all those peripheral factors, such as the presence of the universities themselves and the ballpark being now a very large magnet to the southeast. Also up on your screen, you'll see some of the items. These are, of course, not all the items that we heard on the 2nd of July. We couldn't fit all of them. There were, I think, 4 or 5 full pages of notepads that we ended up scanning, but we distilled a few of these out. You certainly know what they are. We've attempted to formally define the northwest quadrant in terms of a specific program, including the administration building, the council chamber, and those 2 are shown separately just for to the extent that we don't know for sure if they're going to be within the same footprint or not. We want to think about that as we move forward. Certainly the Performing Arts Center, the Public Library in conjunction with the Maricopa Library District, a multi-generational community center, the civic space, which will become the public place within the quadrant, and then all of this surrounded and included with and bracketed by a wealth of developer-driven retail, retail and other commercial or residential enterprises, which will be determined as we move through the developer steps of the process. Also, as part of this is to think about a concept for the university neighborhood. We don't really have a lot of information on what the universities are going to be doing specifically, but we can kind of establish a framework for that. And the park. This is a quick diagram that we put together to try to explain some of these relationships. The key thing to really see here is that it's the PAC and the library and the Multi-Gen Center that really form the synergistic opportunity in the city center, whereby it's something that these public facilities can be mutually shared by both the administration program as well as the universities. And as from what we understand, the universities are very excited about the opportunity to have such facilities within a proximity. So as we go through these plans, we've wanted to think of this as a adjacency diagram of how relationships would take place between various things. There's a few other points on here about that red line at the bottom saying that having a civic image means you see City Hall. The fact that the mixed use meanders through all of these elements, serving all of them, and that there are some external factors like the Indians project and the high school to consider. Although they're not directly connected, they need to be considered within all this. These are some of the bubble diagrams. There were others that we went through. It was essentially an exercise in diagramming program on site and looking at various relationships. These were the diagrams, final diagrams that went to staff for review and comment. Through various meetings and discussions, we started to narrow in on the one up on the upper right, which we called the Civic Square. And that is essentially the basis for what we've moved forward with as our recommendation for the Northwest Quadrant. This is the full bubble plan, a little bit more along because we're 2 weeks later than we thought we originally were going to be on this meeting. What I'd like to do is just take you through it in a very descriptive way, just so that you can see where everything is, and then we can come back later and talk specifically about elements within it. The City Hall is located in red there on the west end of a predominant axis, essentially taking the original loop road through the site, the main street, and turning that into a grand public square. And City Hall would be located at the west end of that approach from Australia down Main Street. To the north of the universities, right now there are 2 universities. There could be more. The idea is just to find a framework where these could inhabit a neighborhood but not necessarily inhabit the same sites. They both, that we spoke to, expressed concern about blurring their own images with each other. So the idea of a street running east-west, a university drive is what we've been calling it, provides an opportunity for them to be in a neighborhood together but to have their own distinct identities on either side of the street. The intent would be for them to start on Estrella. They want to do that so they'll have visibility for drivers, but it also lends itself to being the closest to the northwest quadrant, and that makes sense, and then they would grow to the west towards the park. On the northwest corner of the northwest quadrant would be the library and the multi-generational center. The library would be on the upper side, closest to the universities, with most synergy to those. The multi-gen center would be directly adjacent to City Hall, so that the various meeting spaces and various other things that could happen there, fitness center, et cetera, could be utilized by city employees as well. And then the Performing Arts Center, again, you can see these are between the civic space and the universities for shared use. This has been placed closer to Estrella for marketing visibility and venue attraction. And then framing the south and predominantly the east would be the large parcels that would ultimately get probably subdivided a little bit by the developers into various mixed-use opportunities with, again, retail on the ground floor to be determined above, whether it's residential or commercial or medical. It could be any number of things. The idea is to fill the middle in the lighter shade of beige with parking on at least the lower level so that the parking is to some degree removed from view. One thing to point out, too, we took the curved Main Street and made basically a very wide Main Street, about 400 or so feet, as the civic square. However, there still is an idea to have a smaller scale of retail within the square itself, so that when you're on the street, you're still bounded on both sides by program and activity. However, the scale of those elements in the middle would be more pavilion-like, similar to what you see in places like Bryant Park in New York, or perhaps even Kierland locally, where there's the street, there's the very strong, tall wall of the built structures around the edge, and then in the middle are these very nice restaurants or galleries or visitor centers or cultural elements. Now, all of these pieces of building that I've described are essentially arranged within a framework, an organizing framework of public space, which is about a hierarchy of activity and use and experience of the outdoors. And I'd like to have Doug, my colleague, step in and talk a little bit further about that.
Well, thank you, Joe. It's, again, Your Honor, council members, a pleasure and honor to be here. I guess this is an enterprise that happens once in the life of a city. Your program, this place presided over by a city hall, a library, performing arts, learning, commerce, living are all the ingredients, the classical ingredients of a healthy, vibrant city. The heart of which is the civic square, the city's living room, a place of day and night activity throughout the year, to go and be and sit in a cafe and watch people, and also to partake of the year, the seasons of the year, the performances and events, celebrations that give life to the city. We've looked at places where we've had the good fortune to work and to visit, not only in the region, but literally throughout the world. We know what makes a sustainable, and I think we say that explicitly, a sustainable place, not only in terms of energy conservation, but the creation and sustaining of community through the generations, creating a memorable, attractive, safe place for people to feel like they all belong. Again, the ingredients of urban landscape, of water and light and cafe spaces, shade and shadow. Looking at the dimensions of the scale of the place, you can see we've used some locally known places, both the Kierland and Westgate, to show their comparability in physical dimension and scale to the center City Green, where we would presume that the various functions we've discussed, including amphitheater functions, shade tent, and so forth, would occur. The other organizing activity is the great boulevard or the great mall connecting with these universities. An extraordinary opportunity that has come into play here. Think of the great cities and university towns of the world with these wonderful connections to the university community. And then farther on, some images that come to mind of places that we've lived and worked. And then the great park, this wonderful oasis at the other end of the civic square, shown as a place, the lungs and the open space of the community of great size, and also connected with the larger landscape. Imagining places of comparable scale, both elsewhere and here locally in Phoenix at Indian School Park, a place to encounter the sky and its seasons. Also, there's opportunity for programming of this space for active use, as you can see how sports fields could fit into such a space. And as we go back, again, looking at this as really the spine and the connective tissue of the city. Joe?
Thank you, Doug. The extra time that we've had from the original meeting schedule has allowed us to take a bit of a leap, and I want to qualify this as a leap and to say that these are just ideas at the moment. But we've gone ahead and modeled some of this to give a three-dimensional suggestion of what it could be. This is not a firm resolution of architecture or anything. It is an idea for how these spaces will look or could look, and more so about how the urban space between them could be. Sort of an overhead view. You can see the City Hall on that west axis coming in from the left side. Here's a lower view. Sort of speaking to that sustainability idea as well, on those very large parcels, there's a great opportunity with, while we can take the parking, let's say, and put it on the interior of these retail and commercial buildings, certainly don't need to bring them all the way up the 4 or 5 stories that these buildings may take. So, we could create roof gardens, providing yet another layer of public or private space, meaning in those buildings you see in the foreground, retail on the bottom, maybe 1 or 2 stories of office condos of some sort, and then apartments or condominiums on the upper floors, which would not only enjoy that public side of the street, but could also have their own inner gardens or park-like space for the benefit of the homeowner. And I think that's something that the developers are going to be very interested in. It's also something which is very classically framed in terms of how neighborhoods were developed in London, hundreds of years ago. And it still works today, and it could still work, out here in the desert. Here's just a couple of other views that we were able to pull out. This is the one looking north from Yuma, again into the Great Square, and then down that axis into the university areas. And then a suggestion: the trees, for whatever reason, turned out a little small on this image. They would be much, much larger in reality. They were just planted yesterday, so they'll grow.
Don't let them have sundown.
That more or less gives you our sort of description of the plan. There are a couple things that came up during the meetings with staff that I just would like to go through, and I think there are issues that you may be interested in as well. One was this issue of why we put City Hall where it is, and there was something very deliberate about that. When we set up this very formalized organization to this site, what resulted were the south and east axes, axial entrance points. That's your main street. That's what connects you all the way around to the other quadrants. That's a place of arrival and a place of departure. The north, now with this connection to the universities, is a communal void, for the lack of a better word, that both connects the civic space to the university space. It also acts as the lawn, as you were, in front of the Performing Arts Center and in front of the library before performances. That's where you could set up your tents and you could have your cocktail parties and these types of things. So in essence, on those 3 axes, you're in a public realm, you're in an elevated realm of void space. So what that means is on the 4th axis, City Hall in this entire mix of things is the most important structure, and it needs to be placed as such. So we felt by putting it on that axis, it would give it its due stature amongst all the other things that are going to happen on the site. And whether or not it is tall, which we hope it could be, or not, having that position, I think, gives it the greatest strength within the organization of the site. There's just some diagrams showing that preservation of that view down to the universities by not putting the City Hall on the north side. And this whole issue of the diagonal, which was very big during the specific area plan, if City Hall does want to be a little bit taller than most of the other buildings, putting it on the diagonal, as was shown then, is going to defeat, to some extent, the idea of this amazing view corridor from the 4 corners through the park and then off and over into the mountain ranges. So leaving us with a setup, in a sense, for one's arrival to the city center, predominantly along Estrella from the 10 or from developments to the south, the new freeways to the south, coming down Estrella in either direction and making that turn in, and at that point is where one wants to have that view of what is, the center of Goodyear. And so, again, this is just a suggestion, but the point that you turn in and you're framed by active streetscape and retail, and then in the distance you see this park, you see fountains, you see sculptures, you see monuments to heroes, and then in the distance is the City Hall it's depicted as a rather extravagant sculptural object right now. However, the idea of it being a sculptural object is something that we would encourage to make it what it really is. Another issue that was brought up were these issues of pedestrian links. This can get rather complex. We're going to have to do more study as far as volume and demands. The specific area plan was very good in setting up frameworks for circulation and crosswalks and these types of things. There's lots of aesthetic tools you can use. The fact that you've decided to separate your streets and boulevards with medians provides great opportunities for those refuge places and things that will ease crossing large streets. This would be the predominant circulation areas. Perhaps to start, certainly as volumes grow, there could be need for things like bridges and underpasses. We think, actually let me go back one step. One point worth making is we're trying to achieve an urban vision here, and part of urban life is what you see in those two pictures, and it's a safe but sometimes chaotic mixing of vehicles and people, and simply taking everyone and putting them on a air-conditioned walkway between buildings isn't going to give you that sort of vitality that you see on the street. We've also been meeting with Mr. Tupper at Sun MP, and he's been kind enough to share with us many of the developments that they're a little bit further ahead on the other three sites. So that is one of their drawings depicting how they're going to treat the boulevards and how the landscape and pedestrian crossings could integrate. I will mention that there are some interesting opportunities for off-grade connections. Certainly, you can imagine pedestrian bridges perhaps at the half points, basically at the main street, and what we'd encourage here is that it's an integrated approach to bridges, not necessarily like what you see on the left where it's just an object as a bridge, but rather that the developers would be required to integrate either voids or reserve space within certain corners of their buildings so that stairs or escalators could be added later, and then bridge connections could be made. The partial circle you see there on the bottom right is actually a full circle if we had more plan to show you. And that has the potential to really be an iconic bridge structure perhaps. The one on the left is in Japan. It's not aesthetically very southwest, but the idea that there's a circular ring which really emphasizes almost like a magnifying glass over this intersection of the four corners, that could be developed into something very exciting. I think we do have to look at the technical issues of that in terms of how that might impact visibility to the intersection. We have to also think about how we can make that happen with the three other corners being controlled external to this project, so we'll have to look at that. One place where we definitely see a change in grade as something we could even do from day one would be along Goodyear Boulevard at the north, which is where it says underpass, and that would essentially be an idea to either depress the ground, or maybe depress the ground and raise the street into a little bit of a hump or something, to provide a continuous path of landscape between the city center and that entire university area, whether it gets developed as college buildings or other things as time evolves. That could be something which we could phase in, provide some infrastructure for now. Once the universities are up and running, you could complete it. But that, with the idea of Goodyear Boulevard being a bit of a bypass for folks who will be stupid enough to not want to go to the city center.
Can we quote you on that?
I think providing something there. I mean, there's also, there's issues like, a parent's decision to send their student to college. Hey, I want to go to this college, which is right next to this really active downtown area, but it's across a 6-lane highway. Well, no, there's a really nice underpass. The ground slopes down. You walk under it. You never have to cross the street. Those kinds of things could come into play.
Are you thinking similar to Camelback and 24th, what they just installed there?
I think something like that, but planned ahead. I mean, think of it more in terms of the land. The scale of this is rather large, so it's not a 1 to 12 ramp. It's like a 1 to 2 slope in the landscape that comes down, and then maybe there's two very elegant bridges versus a tunnel that carry the road traffic over. And that you go in between the lanes, between the directions, there's a void, so the light still comes down through. So it's more like a roadway overpass than it is a tunnel.
In Central Park.
Yeah, like the ones in Central Park. That's a good example. Yeah, no, it could be, it could be the thing also where, because of the slope, one of the many amphitheater opportunities being right there in front of the Performing Arts Center, we're even showing that sort of figure of pools that could have a negative edge. It could be something where you're actually going down into this water event, then cross under and go through. The last item we just wanted to touch on, we know it's a bit of a hot button item that we've shown your Goodyear Boulevard squared off. And we just want to point out that the plan was conceived, and you can see the dotted lines on here as well, also the red line on the drawing, which shows that the plan is not unworkable. If the road goes back to being a curve, we haven't done enough engineering or technical evaluation to take an oath that it works perfectly the way we've shown it. We'll do that. We do think as a diagram for this area and acknowledging the connection, which is now so strong up into the north, or could be so strong, that curve had a tendency to disconnect our efforts to connect to that north side. So we showed it this way. I think it's something that we're going to discuss more. There's some folks on your staff who are very interested in discussing it more, and we will do that. And perhaps go back or find an in-between ground to satisfy both the vehicular and overall planning concerns. So that's actually all we have to say today. There's a list that I'm not going to read this. You can look in your handout if you like. These are the kind of things we're going to be doing next, getting more into the specifics of the program for some of these elements. It's all basically coming down to preparing the criteria for the RFP. And if you don't ask for it in the RFPs, you're not going to get it. So we're going to want to work together to get our laundry list of wants and needs, as well as all the technical performance issues together within the next month and a half or so. Those RFPs are scheduled to go out at the end of November, subject to timely receipt of the RFQs. And then once that's out, I think there's a 3 or 4 month preparation period, so that will allow us to go back and start to clean up and get more specific as to the colored blobs that you see today. And I think that's it. I'd be happy to answer a lot of questions.
Okay, thank you, Joe. Let me ask first, would anyone from the public wish to comment or ask a question? Yes, sir. Would you come forward and use the mic, please?
My name is John Mullen. I'd like to ask you what the proposed square footage is that you have laid out there for the Performing Arts Center, for the footprint.
I think we're presently identifying, here's where we think is going to go with the RFPs for the Performing Arts Center. We're actually going to include this whole L-shaped corner. The yellow box represents about 75 to 80,000 square feet, which from what we've seen and what we've looked at seems reasonable. The configuration is obviously up to the submitter. Now, in giving the entire parcel, at least as an option for development, what that means is the developer will be able to, we're going to encourage the Performing Arts Center to be over here on the park and in the connection zone. But by having this as well as a potential add to their property, that enables them to do other things, to develop some mixed use, to put in a parking garage, to do whatever supplemental programs might help make the deal better. Now, if the developers choose to not use all of that site, that's at their discretion. We're going to write it so that they can come back with whatever they want to do on that L, as much of it or as little of it as they think that they need, as long as they follow the rules of the SAP for the street frontages, i.e. to have mixed use and retail, and as long as they put at least the main entrance and orient the Performing Arts Center towards our space and not towards the street or towards...
But with identity on Estrella.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
With iconic identity that you can start to see in the renderings.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Further questions or comments from the public? Okay, seeing none now, why don't we start over on the right with Councilmember Holland?
Just a couple of questions about the park. Once before, I had seen a rendering, and the park was more in the middle of the universities or closer to give it more of a true campus feel. And I notice now we've moved the park off to the west side of that campus area. Was there some kind of reasoning behind that?
I'm actually not sure about the question because, at least in the initial diagrams, we did always think of the park as being to the west.
I guess I thought it was
maybe
more between the universities or more with the universities involved in a park-like setting. That's the way I remembered it, and I just thought maybe if you can, it's okay. I just didn't remember it being moved all the way to the west.
Yeah, we in terms of zoning it and giving them, you having the ability to build a park and have it be there as soon as possible, and for the universities to have flexibility, having it to the west is what made sense to us, and for it to be the landscape buffer to all of the residential neighborhoods on that end. One thing that did come up since an earlier iteration is we had not shown the park-like space between them as elaborate as we show now, and that was shortcoming on our part in the sense that providing this space here really does that, gives you that space in between for, college students to go out and throw a frisbee or do whatever without necessarily being the actual park, which is where people might be playing baseball or kicking the ball around. I honestly do not recall showing one with the park in the middle.
Well, it wasn't the park in the middle. It was more green. They were more centrally located, and there was more campus-like feel around them. And that's where I was coming from. And I remembered that specifically. Did the universities request this new approach, or is this just a design you haven't cleared with them yet? Or
well, the two things that the universities insisted upon, one of which was they both wanted to have their first structures be on Estrella, which started to set up a paradigm of things happening here first and therefore moving that way. We talked about the notion of putting one here or making another sort of four, some out of them here, but they were both very interested in being on Estrella so they could brand the university to people driving by. And from that, it sort of started to make sense to us to start there and allow this to grow. So what really happened here is, when you start out and say they've only built here, you can have all of this to some degree as a park. You wouldn't want to invest in the infrastructure for that.
Sure.
But these could be turfed, and you could have soccer fields or whatever for quite a long time. And as they build, they just keep building. So it's very natural to us to orient it this way. And this space in the middle is not small. By any means, Doug, what are we talking about?
200 feet of green and about 400 feet of open space.
So that's like the width of.
so that's pretty good size. So
Two-thirds of a football field of park within its own right.
And a half-mile long. I think the recollection is correct. The point is very well taken. These are early diagrams, but clearly these university campuses are meant to be in a park-like setting, but also one that is clearly public throughout its spine and becomes a place for the whole community. So the recollection and the priority is absolutely correct.
okay. Well, thank you very much. It looks good. I just wanted to make sure I was getting the details down.
You had a couple questions? No. Good. Councilmember Cavalier?
Yeah, thank you, Mayor. Yes, you've done a lot of work on this, it appears, and you've done a very nice job with this. So I have several comments concerning the structure. One is parking. I haven't heard you address parking. The other thing is the integration. I think that's very important. The purpose of having, or one of the reasons for having the universities in the city center area is to bring people to the city center. And the way you do this is by integration, and you integrate. That library, that performing arts center, that multi-gen center, all the restaurants and the universities have to all come together, and they have to be there so that it's alive with students all day long. People bring integration. Also, without that integration, you don't have sustainability. Without people, you don't have sustainability. So you've got to look at that. Instead of segmenting everything too much, Everything really needs to come together. I've seen 2 examples this week of cities that have done this, and that's how they've made it work. The one that's not working too well because it's too blocked out like this, but the other one is working very well because it's totally integrated. Your park should also be integrated within this whole thing more. I think it should be integrated within the universities more. And this park should be, of course, we haven't talked about what the park will be, but I think it should be something very outstanding. This could be a show park for the city with the Aqua Center and everything that we put into it. But we've got to keep this thing so that it's sustainable. The early morning people come through, they want their coffee, grab a donut or something, and they're off to work. The high school students and parents who bring their students to school come in after that, along with the university students who stay there all day. And then toward the middle morning and afternoon, you have the retired people, the people that are the more leisure-going people. They will occupy it. And then toward evening, the younger people come in, and the activities with all the entertainment and everything will keep that alive all through the evening. And that, again, involves your university people along with the other people from that area. So anyway, it makes it a 24/7 integration. So anyway, I would like to see it integrated a little more, but so far, at this point, it looks pretty good.
And I think all of the goals that you've expressed are what are in our minds as we come up with these things. A couple of quick answers to your question, just to close the loop. The idea for parking is that we don't know for security reasons if parking below City Hall is a good idea. We don't know that what form the developer role will take site-wide. So, for example, could a very large parking garage under the civic space to serve the entire thing work? We just can't answer that question yet until we start talking to the developers. For now, we're imagining, as I mentioned, some of these larger blocks where parking is essentially wrapped in retail and office and other thinner programs in some of these beige areas. For example, this area to serve the administration part, this area to serve here. Short term, as some of this stuff is still on the shelf to get built, surface lots could come into play up there. As far as the integration of the universities, that's something that we were pushing for. The universities did, however, and this is not to say that it's for certain, we can go back to them, but along with being on Australia, their other issue was identity unto themselves and having, quote unquote, their own plot of land to build their campus. And we talked about, well, no, wouldn't you imagine a NYU model where you go to NYU, you can't tell where the city ends, where the commercial buildings end, and where the university begins. They're like, no, we want to be able to have a piece of land that we can put not a physical gate, but an idea of a perimeter that can be associated with us, which is why we went this way for now. That's something that we can certainly revisit with them. We did discuss short-term scenarios where until they're able to justify building, say, an entire 15 or so acre plot, that they could lease, 5 or 10 year lease space in some of that brown as their short-term way to offer night programs or some of these other things, which would help. The other key point to make is neither of them, they both want to have a campus that is a resident campus, so there's not only a commuter population but a resident population. However, they don't want to build dormitories, so the city center will serve, parts of the city center will definitely serve from a developer perspective as a forum for building market rate dormitory type housing, so that you'll have this traffic as students go to classes here, but they all, perhaps not all, but some may live down here. And that's a model that's happening in other campuses all over the country where the housing issue is basically solved on a market basis with developer-led projects.
You want that housing so that they won't have to drive to class. That's as much as possible to keep the automobile.
Yeah, our idea is anything within the colored limits of this plan. Once you're there, you're walking or you're biking or you're rollerblading or there's a horse pulled situation going on or something. But But we don't, we sort of minimized the streets. We need to serve it because clearly we're drawing a lot of people from all over the place. So we need to serve and service the site. But once you're there, we want you to get out of your car and act as though you're in an urban environment, which you are.
Yeah, I'm concerned with the park being back there in the corner because of what it might end up being a problem with our police having to patrol that because it's so isolated. What I fear are isolated corners of the entire city center, so that you don't have an isolation area that will die for lack of traffic. And that's what happens when you don't have a lot of interest and a lot of traffic in that area. It dies. So that's a concern I have.
Can I just ask this question, Mayor? Isn't the school backed up close where the high school is?
Yeah, I mean, there's
No,
still
I
a lot
know,
of
I
work
just-
to be done
I
with
just
the Parks
wanted to show it.
Department, program-wise, and exactly what the city really needs today as far as park-wise. But clearly our decision to put this back here, it came from the idea of the universities growing from Australia. It also came from a lot of building going on here, and perhaps potential objection from very residential neighborhoods immediately adjacent. So to us, the park was not only an amenity to both the residents as well as the city, but it was also a natural landscape buffer to built things. So by having it here, it acts as a little bit of an insulator between what could become a very noisy place at times from residents. It's also back here as an extension, essentially. It's not colored in green, but here's the high school, and here are all the ball fields. So it's really this green belt that extends all the way from Yuma through the playing fields and the tracks and all sorts of things, and becomes a place for students to spill out into
Well, they'll want their
more unorganized sports.
Yeah, they'll want their aquatic centers so that they can do their competitive swimming and that sort of thing there too, as the other schools have. I don't know where they go now for it, but they.
I mean, that's
Desert Edge goes to the water.
I know, but you got to keep that in mind. No, and that's not a part of tonight. I understand that.
Have, crew and the
Yeah.
here or all sorts of
But in designing that, we have to keep those things in mind. And the universities might have a need for that too. So who knows?
Vice Mayor?
I didn't knock that.
Joe, did you have another point?
No, I've got it.
Yeah, build it tomorrow. This is exciting to me. I mean, I sit here and, I look at the kind of the campus type environment that's being created, and I think of this space could rival some pretty large Western higher ed institutions. I mean, I grew up skateboarding, biking, and rollerblading through a quad very similar to this in Stanford University, which is right across the street from my high school. And I look at this and I see Desert Edge High School being right across the street from, University of Incarnate Word and Franklin Pierce, or at least that's what's in my mind out of the two, the institutions that will likely occupy these spaces. And it's exciting that our young kids could go from an elementary school to a junior high to Desert Edge High School in the shadows of a higher education institution and walk across the street and get a 4-year, 6-year, 8-year, 10-year, 12-year diplomas and walk out into the workforce and even do it within the same square mile if they desire to do that. So
Stay here.
and stay here. Yeah, I mean, this is what it's all about. This is pretty exciting. I mean, I wish we could build it overnight. I'll tell you that the things I like, assuming the underpass kind of idea keeps with the kind of articulation of the landscape and not just looking at. I mean, what we see from the aerial perspective is a very geometric picture, a very square picture. But I assume when you're standing at ground level, you're going to see, kind of meandering, rolling type of an environment. I like that thought. I like the thought of carving through the buildings with the pedestrian ways. I see you've done that and kept that continuity from the specific area plan.
Yeah, the arroyo.
And the arroyo, and bringing that through the buildings. And I would hope that maybe other developers in the other corners would do that. I think it offers some unique architecture opportunities. And you made a point about the curvilinear street, and I think that's something that merits discussion here. Is if it's easier, given our harsh environment, to bring those buildings closer together and go to a straight square, or at least maybe square out the rounded curve of that street, I would support that. I hadn't heard that argument that y'all made tonight, prior to tonight, about what that does and the if you will, the triangulation that the curve creates and the space and that you've got to cross now. Rather than 6 lanes of traffic at one intersection, you might have to cross 6 lanes of traffic and then 2 more and then 2 more, and you're at your next destination. So I appreciate that argument and would encourage staff to really, I mean, this is a pedestrian environment. Make this environment for the pedestrian. Obviously, you got to make it doable for cars and doable for individuals to get to and from. But really, I want somebody to be able to walk from City Hall to wherever, or from the universities to wherever that they're going. But I don't have a whole lot of negative other than to say it's exciting. I mean, the architecture, the idea of the urban garden up on the 2nd or 3rd floor and having that private space for the folks that are up in maybe 3rd, 4th, and 5th levels in terms of apartments or condos or what the opportunities that might be occurring there. It's a pretty ingenious plan. I did not realize the size of, when you put the Westgate and the Kierland over the top of that, I didn't realize that we had, I mean, I thought we were going to be crunched in here and too small. So, yeah, I've got nothing to knock it.
Good.
So, looks
Councilmember Lord?
Can I jump for joy?
Yeah.
You can do that.
I'm excited. It's great. I really like the change where you squared it off. I like the whole concept that you're doing. And the highlight for me this evening was a question that was unanswered before, and that was reserving space from the developers to have these crosswalks or underwalks or overpass or whatever we need to move people around the city. And we had not really finalized that in the specific area plan, and people were concerned about it. So I really like the direction you're going in and trying to nail those items down for the city. The other thing is, I will tell you, through all the city center planning time, the neighborhoods adjacent to this wanted the park in their backyard. They did not want the park toward the strawberry. They did not want it parked towards the south. They wanted exactly where you've got it now. That's what they asked for. The one thing they wanted to be able to do is they wanted connectivity from the community to it. That was one of their concerns. But I have to tell you, I'm extremely pleased, and thank you for all your work.
And just one more point on this park. This is I'm not sure what the name of the street is, but this is the swath of undeveloped land. So it really is, no matter what happens up here to the north, this will be fully nestled within the combination of the various neighborhoods.
And really, the way you've got it set up, there's really a lot of gathering spaces. There's a lot of community activities can take place. There's a lot of meeting places, a lot of places to sit. There's a lot of places to enjoy what greenery we're going to put in there, or water, the way you've got it set up. And I can understand the universities wanting their own identity. They're just as competitive as any business. And I think the visibility where they are is really good. And this is going to evolve for quite a long time. There's going to be a lot of open space. And I think we talked to the universities about grassing in or sort of making park-like area in front of their property until they build on it. So,
if you recall, Doug showed that option for this to be ball fields or whatever. I would think this could be a great place for people to go to. And I think the operative word of having to go to it, that's important. You don't want it along the highway. You don't want it visible from a strip mall. You want it hidden in the center. But then now all of this is where you could put your a bunch of soccer fields for kids on Sundays and a bunch of baseball fields for the universities. Won't mind. It's not a huge investment. It's turf and irrigation. It's not building lakes and paths and roads and all this stuff. And then over time, maybe this starts to shift to a more defined sports-centric place. Just to touch on the bridges, I'm pointing to something which isn't there, but we're going to work with Mr. Tupper on all fronts to look at ways that we can, there he is, to think about this bridge idea and how we can both proceed with our plans so that is an option. It's not an option which has any long-term negative retail or financial hardships, meaning it could be space that could be leased, but it could be leased with some sort of clause that it's replaced somewhere else, when and if the time for a bridge becomes necessary, and then we'll have foundation issues to address to keep that
And I think we need to be
figured out.
you know, you have to consider the developer also and have a collaborative type
Yeah.
dialogue going on to make sure that it's a consensus building for.
And ultimately, that connection's,
It's an advantage for them also to have that connectivity. So.
it serves everybody to have those connections be as strong as possible between both sides. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Souza?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Not to be a dead horse, but I think that the park where you've located is an excellent spot. And what we've got to remember is that there is going to be a lot of residential in this particular area. And the park is not designed specifically for the civic center area. It is for the total community that is in that location. Because we're lacking, we would be lacking for park area if we don't have a park concept. And I appreciate the depth of what you've gone. You folks have done an excellent job. We keep talking about 2 universities. I thought we were talking about 3 universities.
We have 2 universities that we have an agreement with to lease land here. We have no agreement with St. Francis at this time.
That's it. What if they agree to come into this project?
Well, there's hardly any room for them right
Yeah.
now.
And say, where would they realize it?
Yeah, I think they do. There's another 200 square miles in Goodyear,
That's right.
so,
Yeah.
That's right.
and we'd love to have them, by the way.
I mean, it could be something that you could set up, the arms that's set up by the street. You can imagine each of these, separated by a street, not in the same block, to be separated. One of them could be another elementary school or a high school. There could be all sorts of possibilities. I will mention that the folks at the high school, as well as the universities, will mutually excited to be next to each other. The university's known that they could offer AP programs and vocational training potentials for high school students, and as well as the universities or the high school to be in a context of higher education that sort of will encourage students to go forward with that, and knowing that the universities will make the library even more than could be under normal circumstances as a public library is all good news for everybody.
How many square footage seats have you allocated for the civic hall itself?
Right now, the Red Square is 42,000 square feet.
And for performing arts, you said
Well, 75 plus probably another 75 on the ground area. It's about 150. That's a footprint, and the 40 footprint for City Hall is based upon our preliminary look at your needs and our experience with City Hall. That doesn't mean that it's 40,000 square feet up into the sky. It means that's to have a nice arrival point and a service counter for city employees. It's to have the council chambers over here, the actual tower. I use the tower term loosely because it means maybe 6, 8, 10 at most stories. But for Goodyear, for Phoenix, it's tower. And that wouldn't necessarily be in the 40 range.
I would hope that you keep in mind, okay, that this is a city that's going to be moving into 150, 200,000 people. And consequently, if this is going to be the City Hall area, okay, you're going to have to leave room for expansion as well. So you've got 300 people right now administratively that you're going to have to consider to put in that, what is the 42,000 square feet?
No, that's the footprint on the ground. The current program, and I'm reciting numbers out of my head, but our colleague has gone through and spoken to everybody, and I remember during the specific area plan, certain typically located municipal things are not going to be on this campus, like courts and such, but he's gone through all the programs that you have identified in departments, and I think we're up to about 180, I want to say, or close to 200,000 square feet for today to fit everybody. And that over the next 20 years, that will approximately double, which is, if you take the 40 and multiply it by 10 floors, there's 400,000 square feet as a ballpark. So the intent is to build City Hall with a certain amount of growth built into it. The developer can realize that through leases to others over 20-year periods, which is more than enough, or you could lease it to county organizations. Everybody's looking for space at a government level, so you could even lease it to an interdepartment that you don't expect to be here long term, but that will have its own campus, Public Works or something later. They could move in. That's the intent, how to satisfy growth to some degree. Also, when we go through a phasing diagram, this sort of parcel here would be the last to probably get built. So that would not preclude the potential for City Hall to grow essentially to the south all the way down to Yuma along that swath. We could preserve that corridor, or we could write it into the developer agreement that he can have this for the next 20 years for retail and condos, but on year 20 in one day, it's being torn down and you're going to expand your City Hall on the land. And that just has to be written out that way. But that's the intent, for it to grow that way.
Can I ask a follow-up to that, Dick? Do you mind? The square footage, I'm just, real quick, the square footage is then, when you said 75,000 for the performing arts, that's the footprint?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. So all of those numbers that are on your plan are footprints, not necessarily final build-out numbers.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you can read it on your handout, but all of the colors in the quad here, buildings, they add up to approximately $1.5 million. That's your ground. Yeah. And those are what we call bubbles. They're not the building's perimeter edge. They don't reflect ins and outs and entrances and all that kind of stuff. But there's a lot of space.
Joe, is Sun MP keep moving along with this project as expected?
Are they what?
Are they moving along with the project?
With their project or with ours?
Are they in sync with?
Yeah, well, I mean, we've been using whatever opportunities we need to talk to them, and they've been very helpful. They've provided us a lot of information, and specifically on things like these connections across the streets, we're going to be talking a lot. And they're following the same specific area plan that we're going to follow. Okay. So hopefully, when there are times that we're not directly communicating, we should be ending up in the same place. If not, we can go back and work on that. But I mean, we're aware of the submissions that are in, and I think we were kind of on a little bit of a holding pattern, waiting to see where those went in terms of a final before we made any detailed movement on that.
Thank you, Mr.
One other thing, we love that delivery date at the City Hall.
Yes, you can thank Mr. Nichols for
keep
that.
that in mind.
We like that. That is really good.
Somebody's going to be held to that.
Just want to say thank you for that.
Okay, there was one differing view here, and that was on the park. Was that 25 acres or so of a park? Something like, is that 20?
Yeah, it's about. I would say it's about 20. I mean, if you include.
No, I don't.
The square is about 20. Yeah, because it was 30 and 30, and then we took up some of this stuff, so we wanted to give the universities what they owed.
Councilmember Holland and Councilmember Cavalier were concerned about that being all by itself.
Yeah, closer to 30, sorry.
And then Councilmember Lord and Councilmember Souza sort of like it like that. I sort of entered this argument with wanting it more integrated, but I thought you made some good arguments about why it would be where it is. Do we want to discuss that anymore, or?
It's not a big deal as far as I'm concerned.
Are you happy with the way it is?
Yeah, I can live with it.
Quickly?
I didn't vocalize, but I'm fine with where it's at.
I knew you were.
Yeah.
No, you did
didn't mention me
vocalize.
by name, but I'm fine.
No, you didn't say it, but you loved everything.
Yeah. If that was built that way today, I would be perfectly content.
And I'm okay. Because my real concern was how much had it changed and was there demands on the universities and that type of thing. But I think it's fine. I think you explained it well.
Yeah, I mean, the biggest issue is that they, presented with an option, say, flipping that, they didn't want to be buried in the back, and the park didn't want to be on the highway.
Every other commercial thing on that street's going to be up against the road.
I mean, we'd be happy to put together a few more options just so that you can see what that would look like if you'd like, and that's perfect.
There's nothing wrong with doing that if it's affordable. But you're getting strong support here, but a few touches. I don't think anybody would oppose that.
Yeah, well, the mall keeps getting more.
The mall's sort of neat. Is that sort of like you could have a walking and all that? Yeah.
Yeah, people will ride their rollerblades around it, and they could.
Well, bikes.
Bikes.
And that's what we hadn't thought of. That's part of the park,
That's
too.
the park. That's part of the experience.
Yeah, this only looks, it's sort of small because how big that is. And this is,
200 feet, Joe.
Yeah, I'm just going to point out, I mean, if you include the roads, that's
400 feet.
That's a football field.
Yeah.
It's Cardinal Stadium, so big.
What happens to the SAT site? Or is that your task? Maybe that's not your task.
It's part of our world. we haven't to date been letting it steer us. I mean, it's the kind of thing that never anticipated stuff like this happening, and as such, we've just begun really to start investigating that and how that's going to be dealt with. And it's a technical. There's a technical solution out there. Probably the biggest issue is just the wetness of the ground that has to be starting to get dealt with soon if this site's going to be buildable in 12 months or so.
Plus, we have to move that effluent somewhere.
Yes.
And I remember David Iwanski coming to and speaking to us at one point on that could all be moved and we could use the water resources there for some of it.
Yeah,
that's true, but we need a decision.
Oh, yeah.
And what we're going to do with it.
For your perspective, there are solutions to it. I personally don't think it should wag the dog, but in terms of what we want to do on the site. But it's a decision that has to be made rather soon because what's going to need it to be done does take some time.
It has to dry out, too.
Yes.
Give more specifics to rather soon. I mean, what kind of dry out period are we talking about before we construct on that site? And I see Sean really chomping at the bit behind you.
Yeah, I think we need to hear from our water guy.
I mean, how long are we?
Mayor, Council, we're not exactly sure how long it needs to dry out, but we do recognize that the sooner we can stop recharging our effluent, the quicker that dry out process can start. We've actually met with our CM at risk team at the 157th expansion, and we're fast tracking the discharge. The city has the ability to discharge. It has a permit to discharge to the river. We just need to build a physical pipeline there. So we're actually working with the irrigation district and using them as a bridging mechanism to get the effluent into the canal in a short-term basis, and then look longer term to build a structure to the river. I think in the city's central planning area, that plant's going to probably, depending on land usage, probably top out at about a 16 to 18 million gallon per day facility. I don't think that we could recharge and reuse all of it. So at a minimum, we're going to need some type of exit point, and the river can obviously accommodate whatever flows we could bring there. So we're going to fast track that, get that site to start to dry out, and what our hope was is if we can integrate a SAT site in with that park, they show that water feature there, or even at a minimum have recharge facilities throughout the green areas. Dry wells, you wouldn't see them, they'd be below grade, but re-injection wells or dry wells and re-inject as much effluent as we can in that area. I think we'll need to do studies, check the hydrology. You can only push so much water into the ground, and we'll try to get as much as we can in either through a water feature or a combination with wells, and then the rest will hopefully be reused in other development that we have, Baseball Village and all the other great things that are coming. And then at a last resort, whatever is left, the excess, would then be discharged to the river. So.
Yeah, we just need decisions made.
Absolutely.
I think we were aware of the option. I loved hearing them, however. To reuse that water there is a great idea. But we need the decisions made.
I agree, Mayor. I think what we want to do as a department is get the structure to get the water out of the SAT site, and then once decisions are made, do we put it in as a new water feature? Do we do re-injection? We can be out of town and let those decisions be made, and then when we're ready to put infrastructure back in, then put it in. But I think it's important that we get kind of out of the way and get that SAT site offline, and then decide what we need to do.
And one of the quadrants is named water, right?
Yes.
And I think that's Sun MP's one of your quadrants has we've named it water to have some type of water feature in that.
I think the consultant hit the nail on the head that we can't. The SAT site can't be the tail that wags the dog. We need to have structures in place so that when we are ready, we can shut it off and let it dry out. And that's what we're working towards. Good.
I don't understand that. It is the dog that wags the tail right now. If we don't have a decision in line for that, how are we building anything? We have to know what we're going to do with that water before we build anything. That's what City Hall's going to be about, isn't it?
Yes, what we want to do is we want to build a structure that gets us to the river so that we can shut the SAT site off and no longer recharge our effluent while the city decides and works with developers to decide what needs to happen.
You sound like you're in the active decision-making mode right now to evaluate how quickly we can get that done and that way you guys can.
Long-term, as a utility, we do not have the hydraulic capacity to recharge all of our effluent on this piece of property. So we need an alternative anyways. So our thought is to get it into a pipeline, into a canal, and then decide where we want to do and what we want to do it. But you can't do anything if we're still recharging.
Do you need for us to, I mean, are we going to have something to come back to City Council having to do with getting the pipeline started, or do you need anything like that from us?
No, actually, that structure is part of the process and the approval that you've given us to expand the plant from its current $4 million that's under construction to $6 million. So that component is in there.
Okay.
It's part of the process. Malcolm Perney and Archer Western have authorization from council to build it, and we want to start that process immediately.
So it's
that
just time.
the city has more options. If we're still recharging, I think it's going to limit what we can do, and especially when we can do it.
Okay.
And Joe, thank you.
Thank you.
Parking for the city hall initially, is it going to be down in that lower southwest quadrant? Is that what you're planning, or
The what?
parking for city hall?
Yeah, well, we would envision
Right.
somewhere in this vicinity. And again, it would be nice to get a garage in this area to really be shared daytime for City Hall, nighttime for performing arts. We'll have to see what the developer is exactly on that.
Okay.
There's a huge premium to building an underground structure that I'm not sure would fly in a private context.
Be better to go up.
Yeah.
Well,
Along the perimeter, and these blocks enable us to do that, and you have added benefits that once you stop your garage, you can do an inner garden. One last point about the recharge. We're also, on this side of the project, we are moving ahead and we're getting a geotechnical engineer to go out there and drill some holes so that we can really determine the extent. We don't know how fast the water is seeping. So, until we know that, we're really not going to be able to say for sure how long it's going to take to dry out and what the implications are in terms of starting to build. I mean, it could be a situation, depending on the geotechnical report, that you have to dig out a certain amount anyway, because wet or not wet, the soil is not buildable upon from a structural standpoint. So once all that's settled, we'll let you guys know, and together with what they're doing to turn it off. We certainly know that with all that green out there, it needs to be irrigated. It's going to have to be turned off to some extent during a construction period, but a lot of it can come back in the forms of irrigation through many of these areas. And we can do a calculation rather quickly just based upon, say, that amount of green space, what sort of irrigation requirements there are. I don't think you want to do 100% with that type of water, but you could certainly do overnights and that sort of thing with it. And drips. Anyway.
Okay. We good?
Yeah.
All right. What time is that? 6:14? Is that? No, 6:09. How about 6:15? We'll start council.
Okay.
This meeting is adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
You win.